Okay, I'm delighted to be introducing Matthew on this occasion. I'm always delighted to introduce anybody. I'm going to introduce anybody at the drop of a hat, but I mean, with Matthew, we have roots that go back a long time, slightly not quite entangled with each other, but Matthew did his DPhil in Oxford, and I had the honor of supervising it, not that it took a great deal of supervising. I was looking at his book again, on Goethe's naturalistic anthropology. It also had the snappy title, which I don't think comes from Goethe, but must have come from you, Man and Other Plants. And that's quite a nice sort of witty summary of Goethe's naturalistic anthropology. So it came to you in the middle of the night sometimes. Was it the title or what?
It's a long story.
Oh. You better decide with you.
Maybe we'll talk about it after.
After, yes, later on. Okay. What is more important and really very serious is that we've known for some time that Matthew has been writing a biography of Goethe. And one thought, well, you know, there are lots of biographies of Goethe, some of them still in progress and not yet reached their third volume. When I corresponded with Matthew, he made it clear that he was actually writing an intellectual biography. So he's gone back, in a sense, to the kind of work he was doing for his DPhil, working on a project on Goethe's science, but starting again with the beginnings, a reassessment. I find that rather exciting, and I hope the paper will be as exciting as it promises to be. But so he's been there before, and he's now coming back to that and going through Goethe's scientific thinking in a chronological way and constituting an intellectual biography. And I think that's something that one can look forward to in a higher degree, certainly quite different degree from other biographies that don't have a particular central theme that they're key to in Goethe's cultural intellectual life. So really, you better tell us what's going on.
Thank you very much, Jim. That's very, very, very kind. Right, so what I'm going to say this evening is it's sort of more or less an extract from the book that is in progress at the moment. So Jim's introduction is very apposite, as well as being very generous, as usual. So let's kick off. According to a conversation in 1824 recorded by Kanzler von Müller, Goethe had this to say about the beginnings of his interest in science. Ich kam höchst unwissend in allen Naturstudien nach Weimar und erst das Bedürfnis, den Herzog bei seinen mancherlei Unternehmungen, Bauten, Anlagen praktische Ratschläge geben zu können, trieb mich zum Studium der Natur. Ilmenau hat mir viel Zeit, Mühe und Geld gekostet. Dafür habe ich aber auch etwas dabei gelernt und mir eine Anschauung der Natur erworben, die ich um keinen Preis umtauschen möchte. It's certainly true that Goethe's involvement in the doomed Ilmenau project explains why he started to learn about geology in the late 1770s. And this was his first step on the road to becoming a scientist. But there's a difference between using science to solve practical problems, such as how to extract silver ore from the ground, and pursuing science in order to understand the natural world. Goethe's comment to Kanzler von Müller explains his interest in the former, but not the latter. It doesn't explain why he became interested in science as an intellectual activity. And as George Wells pointed out, I quote, Goethe turned to science at first for practical ends, but soon ranged far more widely than they dictated. The duchy's practical needs don't explain why Goethe became interested in so many branches of science, or why he thought that through them he could capture die Einheit des Ganzen, the unity of the whole of nature, as he put it in the mid-1790s. Now, in a moment, I'm going to say a little bit more about that phrase, die Einheit des Ganzen, and the ways Goethe uses it. But first, I just want to note one of the relevant authorities for this important idea, the idea that science ought to involve thinking of nature as a totality. In the appendix to the transcendental dialectic of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant argues that science needs to be guided by the regulative idea that nature is a unity. We can't know that nature is a unity, but the principle that it is one is, Kant says, ein rechtmäßiges und treffliches regulatives Prinzip der Vernunft. And its useful function is, zur systematischen Einheit den Weg vorzuzeichnen. Governed by this regulative principle, we practice science as if the universe is consistent and forms a single system, die Einheit des Ganzen. Goethe was interested in the thought that there might be different reasons for and modes of practicing science. And on more than one occasion, he drew up classifications of the different motivations for scientific practice. The phrase die Einheit des Ganzen comes from one such exercise, written during the mid-1790s when Goethe was in intensive discussion with Alexander von Humboldt. In these notes, Goethe identifies 4 types of scientists in ascending order of status. At the bottom of the scale are the exploiters of nature, who see the natural world in terms of its use value for humans. Next come the collectors of knowledge, those who use nature, but with no purpose other than to own and marvel at it. Ranked above them are the observers, who do science purely for its own sake, but are only interested in empirical particulars. And in the 4th and highest category are the systematic thinkers, die Umfassenden, die man in einem stolzeren Sinne die Erschaffenden nennen könnte. Those who act im höchsten Sinne produktiv and who, indem sie nämlich von Ideen ausgehen, sprechen die Einheit des Ganzen schon aus. Und es ist gewissermaßen nachher die Sache der Natur, sich in diese Idee zu fügen. This is Kant's regulative idea, that the questions we ask of nature should assume that it's a totality. When Goethe wrote these notes, as well as thinking about Kant, he was probably also thinking about his own studies in science since his appointment to the Ilmenau Mining Commission in 1776. At first, he had been interested in geology for its use value. In subsequent years, he became, and remained, an avid collector and observer. And then came the final step in becoming a scientist, the step into systematicity. So what I want to do in this evening's talk is identify the moment at which Goethe made this step and what triggered it. And the first part of the talk will reconstruct this moment and its consequences in the immediately following years. I don't think this has been done before, though I should say Wolf von Engelhardt comes quite close to doing it, I think. Excuse me. The second half of the talk will consider how this moment shaped the kinds of questions that Goethe asked of nature during the rest of his life. What were the systematic questions that Goethe's science asked? One caveat, though. When I say Goethe's science, I'm not talking about his studies of colour and optics, which are another matter altogether. The work Goethe did for the Ilmenau project led him to read up on geology, mineralogy, and other associated disciplines and techniques, such as chemistry, which was required for assaying metal ores. He did this enthusiastically, but from the perspective of an administrator and with a view to generating wealth for the duchy. Even when his new geological passion became poetically productive, the motivation was silver. Du stehst mit unerforschtem Busen geheimnisvoll offenbar über der erstaunten Welt und schaust aus Wolken auf ihre Reiche und Herrlichkeit, die du aus den Adern deiner Brüder neben dir wässerst. Arztreise in Winter ends by celebrating the mysterious yet manifestly visible mountain as a source of wealth. We've learnt other valuable things along the way in the poem, but the journey to the Harz was motivated by and ends with the veins of silver and the wealth that they pour out into the surrounding territories. But then nothing happened. No actual mining was done at Ilmenau for years, mainly because of legal wrangles over the ownership of the mines. Perhaps the delay, the combination of an impulse and then a vacuum, was fortunate. It allowed Goethe to prepare himself intellectually. He did lots of reading, among which was the trigger that made him interested in science proper, in science as a systematic pursuit. In April 1780, he read Les Epochs de la Nature, the fifth supplementary volume of Buffon's Histoire naturelle. His reaction to reading the Epoch is documented in an excited letter to Johann Heinrich Merck. Die Epochen de la Nature von Buffon sind ganz vortrefflich. Ich acquiesziere dabei und leider nicht, dass jemand sagt, es sei eine Hypothese oder ein Roman. Es soll mir keiner etwas gegen ihn im Einzelnen sagen, als der ein größeres und zusammenhängenderes Ganze machen kann. Wenigstens scheint mir das Buch weniger Hypothese als das erste Kapitel Moses zu sein. Goethe sees two virtues in Buffon's account of the origins of the earth. First, it's synoptic and systematic, groß and zusammenhängend. Second, it's more plausible than Genesis. That second point might seem like damning Buffon with faint praise. I don't think that's what Goethe means. I think what he actually means is, well, it's more of a provocation. He's saying the story of the creation of the earth in Genesis cannot be taken seriously, and we need to remember that. The charge that Buffon's account is a hypothese or a roman is more complex. It's a response partly to Buffon's own acknowledgement that his theory was hypothetical, and partly a response to his critics, such as Georg Forster, who claimed that Buffon's history of the earth was a roman. According to Buffon's account, the earth originated as a fragment of molten mineral that had been dislodged from the sun by the impact of a comet. In place of the traditional biblical chronology, Buffon proposed, on the basis of some elaborate calculations, that the earth was around 100,000 years old. However, he admitted that this account was hypothetical, though only as a tactical retreat in response to Christian outrage. The 100,000-year chronology was just a philosophical hypothesis, he said, and not a statement of fact. So he reassured the Sorbonne theologians. The comet theory and the calculations of the rate of the Earth's cooling involved a lot of conjecture. In his letter to Merck, Goethe seems to regret Buffon's semi-retraction of his challenge to the biblical chronology. Goethe believed in Buffon's heretical chronology and continued to advocate it. So, in a letter to Merck in 1782, he stated that even the most recent period in the Earth's history was gegen unsere gewöhnliche Zeitrechnung ungeheuer alt. However, Goethe could not deny that Buffon's account was a reconstruction of events that were now hidden from us. And in that sense, Georg Forster was right to argue that the history of the Earth in the Epoch was a Roman. And Goethe soon came round to Forster's view, in part at least. If people called Buffon's Epoch a roman, well, that was because novels were the only source from which they could learn such marvelous things, he wrote to Merck in October 1780. Over the next year, he began to plan his own Roman über das Weltall, according to a letter to Charlotte von Stein of December 1781. He didn't get very far with it, but that was partly because Herder was already doing the same thing. Books 1 to 3 of Herder's Ideen zur Philosophie der Geschichte der Menschheit contain a conjectural history of the planet Earth, its geology, flora, and fauna, a systematic story of our natural world. When the frostiness in their relationship suddenly thawed in August 1783, Goethe began to help Herder with these sections of the Ideen. In December, he wrote to Kniebel about the chapters dealing with the origins of the Earth. Die ersten Kapitel haben wir vorgestern zusammengelesen. Sie sind köstlich. Welt- und Naturgeschichte rast jetzt recht bei uns. And as he described this period much later, unser tägliches Gespräch beschäftigte sich mit den Uranfängen der Wassererde und der darauf von alters her sich entwickelnden organischen Geschöpfe. In 1809, according to Falk, Goethe claimed that he was the source of much of the material on natural history in the early chapters of the Ideen. Meanwhile, his own Roman über das Weltall remained a small fragment, the text usually referred to as über den Granit. This short text is a couple of snapshots of the history of the Earth. Only snapshots, but the ambition of the text is clearly synoptic and systematic. It spans the whole history of the Earth and comprises geology, flora, and fauna, just like the opening books of Herder's Ideen. Both, it seems to me, were stimulated by Goethe's reading of Buffon's Epoch in April 1780. Buffon's natural history was systematic in method as well as scope. He laid an absolute prohibition on the use of final causes or teleological explanations in natural history. The proper objective of natural history, and I quote, est de connaître le comment des choses, la manière dont la nature agit. Et nous substituons à cet objet réel une idée vaine en cherchant à deviner le pourquoi des faits, la fin que la nature se propose en agissant. Goethe read this passage from Buffon's volume on quadrupeds in May 1782. And Buffon's prohibition on teleological explanations stayed with him. It's been claimed, for instance, by Engelhardt, that Goethe first became opposed to final causes in science after reading Kant's Kritik der Urteilskraft in 1790, a claim which is but partly based on a letter from Köhler to Schiller in October 1790, where Köhler writes that in der Kritik der teleologischen Urteilskraft hat Goethe Nahrung für seine Philosophie gefunden. In fact, well before he read Kant, and even before reading Buffon, Goethe knew the arguments against final causes in the appendix to Book 1 of Spinoza's Ethics, which he read in 1773 to 74. He says as much in a letter to Zelter in 1830. But it was Buffon's opposition to final causes that had the most impact on Goethe's scientific thinking. So in 1786, when Herder, in the course of revising the drafts of the Ideen, eventually himself renounced teleological explanations, it was on Herder's prompting, Goethe's prompting, on Goethe's prompting. Herder's manuscripts contain markings by Goethe that highlight Herder's lapses into teleology, which Herder then modified. And when Goethe resumed work on mammal osteology in 1790, he jotted a note by way of reminder to himself of the key argument in Buffon's volume on quadrupeds. Buffon gegen die causas finales. Reading Buffon changed the way Goethe looked at the Ilmenau project. In 1776, at the project's inception, Johann Carl Wilhelm Voigt, the younger brother of Goethe's ministerial colleague, Christian Gottlob von Voigt, had been sent to complete his education at the mining academy in Freiberg under Germany's most eminent mineralogist, Abraham Gottlob Werner. On his return to Weimar in 1780, Voigt was employed by the administration to advise on the geology of Ilmenau. He recommended that Goethe read Werner's Von den äußerlichen Kennzeichen der Fossilien, a rather arid exercise in what Werner termed geognosy, the identification of minerals from their external appearance. In September 1780, Goethe wrote to Sophie von La Roche of his new passion. Ich gebe, seit ich mit Bergwerksachen zu tun habe, mit ganzer Seele in die Mineralogie. The fact that the work on the mine was still in abeyance allowed him to devote himself to his new passion. He instructed Voigt to begin a geognostic survey of the duchy and drafted a set of directions for him. He reported on Voigt's findings in a long letter to Merck in October 1780. But now it seemed to Goethe that the practical value of Voigt's work for Ilmenau was not the greatest of its merits. What mattered more was understanding the different layers that made up the Earth's crust in the manner of Buffon's Epochs. In addition to Buffon and Werner, Goethe read Barthélemy Fougeat de Saint-Fond and Pierre Bernard Palissou on geology, both of whom were essential reading, he wrote to Merck in 1781. He also read the Swede Axel Kronstedt and the Genevan mountaineer and geologist Horace Benedict de Saussure. Goethe had met Saussure on the Swiss journey in 1779, but that was before he read Buffon's Epochs, and there's no evidence that Goethe and Saussure discussed geology back then. We only know that Goethe asked Saussure for advice on routes for the next and most challenging leg of their Alpine tour. His reading in 1780 and 81 persuaded Goethe that there was great progress to be made, as he wrote to Merck. Dies Feld ist, wie ich jetzt erst sehe, kurze Zeit mit großem Fleiß bebaut worden. Und ich bin überzeugt, dass bei so vielen Versuchen und Hilfsmitteln ein einziger großer Mensch, der mit den Füßen oder dem Geist die Welt umlaufen könnte, diesen seltsamen zusammengebauten Ball ein für allemal erkennen und uns beschreiben könnte. Was vielleicht schon Buffon im höchsten Sinne getan hat. Whereas on the trip to Switzerland in the winter of 79-80, Goethe had insufficient knowledge of the geology of the Alps to understand much of what he saw. From the summer of 1780, his travels would involve making detailed observations in a geognostical diary. He accompanied Voigt on his surveys. He also travelled on his own or with other companions, sometimes natural historians, sometimes local experts, sometimes friends, Kniebel, and even the Duke. The artist Kraus sketched rock formations for him. The remainder of the talk is going to look at what Goethe found in geology and what happened when his interests spread from geology into mammal anatomy and botany. In other words, when he embarked on his Buffon-inspired journey towards understanding all three kingdoms of nature as belonging to one entity. A strong hint of what's to come is given in Über den Granit. Here Goethe sets out the question he faces as a student of geology. This is a long quotation, and I'm just going to paraphrase it. When we look at rock formations, what do we actually see? Mainly disorder and confusion. And the scientific literature doesn't help. It can't seem to agree on a single explanation. But both our superficial impression of disorder and the disagreements in the scientific literature are contradicted by our intuition that nature has stable and constant forms. The questions we ask of nature will be questions about form. In September 1783, he travelled to the Harz again. From Clausthal, he wrote to Charlotte von Stein, hier bin ich recht in meinem Elemente und freue mich, dass ich finde, ich sei auf dem rechten Wege mit meinen Spekulationen über die alte Kruste der neuen Welt. The speculations probably refer to two phenomena that were preoccupying him. One was the regularity of the masses of granite. These were divided into horizontal strata, which were further divided by vertical fissures running north-south and running roughly east-west at uniform but non-perpendicular angles to the north-south fissures. In combination, the north-south and east-west fissures created rhomboidal shapes. The second point of interest was that granite seemed to make up the base layer of many rock formations and might therefore be the oldest stratum of the crust, as Saussure proposed in his Voyage dans les Alpes. Through 1783 and into 1784, Goethe became increasingly convinced that these two phenomena expressed something fundamental about the ancient formation of the Earth's crust. During a trip to Eisenach and the Thüringer Wald in the summer of 1784, he examined the sandstone layers known as Rotliegend, which also conformed to his model, he wrote in his notes. Es ist ein geschichtetes Gebirge, das durch große vertikale Spalten getrennt ist. In another note from the same trip, he observed, die Flötsklüfte der Schichten oft unsichtbar, die Gangklüfte sichtbar, wird durch dieselbe auch rhomboidisch getrennt. Art von Trennung einen Mittelpunkt. In 1820, reflecting on his early geological researches, he recalled the model that he'd developed in 1783 and 84. Man glaubte gefunden zu haben, dass bei der Solideszenz eine Richtung der Klüfte nach Norden stattgefunden. Die Querklüfte aber von Westen nach Osten nicht rechtwinklig kreuzend. Die rhombischen Ablösungen verursachend. Man hatte ein Modell im Sinne. The discovery in June 1784 was enough to prompt a confident letter to Herder. Auf den Felsen bin ich fleißig herumgestiegen und habe viel gefunden, das mir taugt. Auch glaube ich, ein ganz einfach Prinzipium entdeckt oder vielmehr so angewendet zu haben, dass es die Bildung der größeren Steinmassen völlig erklärt. The rhomboidal forms that Goethe found in granite and Rotliegend were visible evidence of a process described in the geological literature he was reading by Saussure, Richard Kirwan, Jean-Baptiste Louis-Romé de Lille. Insofar as the external appearance of rock formations provided evidence of the nature of their formation, the rhomboidal forms, which are shaped like massive crystals, indicated that granite was formed by a process of crystallization, or as he put it in 1820, solidification. Writing in the early 1780s, der ganze Bau unserer Erde ist aus der Kristallisation zu erklären. Or again, als unsere Erde sich zu einem Körper bildete, war ihre Masse in einem mehr oder weniger flüssigen Zustande. Die Auflösung war durch ein innerliches Feuer geschehen. Der Kern der Erde kristallisierte sich und ist wahrscheinlich die schwerste Masse. Der äußerste Kruste des Kernes ist der Granit. This raised a more general question. Why crystallization? A general philosophical answer is provided by the Aristotelian doctrine of hylomorphism, the idea that form inheres in substance, and that therefore form and substance are inseparable. It's an answer that doesn't really explain anything, but it satisfied Goethe at this stage of his geological research, as his notebooks attest. All substances have within them a form towards which they will tend, so that we can call this form the substance's telos with Aristotle, or its Vollendung. So ist die äußere regelmäßige beständige Form die Vollendung eines Dinges. Granite will take rhomboidal forms, assuming it manifests freely. Wenn frei wird, wenn seine inneren Teile und innere Natur nach ihren eigenen ewigen Gesetzen zusammenfinden können. If there's one idea that typifies Goethe's mature thought in science and in the arts, it is the inextricable unity of form and substance. In 1781, Goethe began to study anatomy. He attended Justus Christian Loder's lectures and dissections in Jena. In May 1782, he read the volume of Buffon's Natural History concerned with quadrupeds. That was where he found Buffon's arguments against final causes. Through 1782 and 83, he continued to labor over skeletons with Loder. In April 1783, the poet Friedrich von Matisson visited Weimar in the company of the Göttingen anatomy professor Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who was full of praise for Goethe's knowledge of anatomy. Through the winter of 83-84, Goethe and Loder examined mammal skulls. Goethe's attention was drawn, and here I'm telling a story that's very, very familiar, but I won't spend long on it. Goethe's attention was drawn to a bone formation in the mammalian palate that carries the incisor teeth, the intermaxillary bone. Whereas in most mammals, the sutures between the intermaxillary formation and the main maxillary bone remain visible throughout an animal's development. In adult humans, the sutures seem to disappear due to the extreme foreshortening of the human face as compared to other apes. This led some authorities, including Blumenbach, Samuel Thomas Zummerink, and the eminent Dutch anatomist Peter Kamper, to claim that the intermaxillary bone was not a feature of human anatomy. In fact, in France, Vic Dazier had already shown that Kamper was wrong, but his work was not well known in Germany. Indeed, its absence from humans could be interpreted as a sign of humans' anatomical uniqueness. And since the form of the palate could, speculatively of course, be linked to the faculty of speech, the uniquenesses of humans as speaking and rational beings could be related to their unique anatomy. Humans were a unique creation, godlike in form and function. Contrary to this conservative view, Goethe believed that his observations provided evidence of the existence of the intermaxillary sutures in humans and hence demolished the doctrine of human uniqueness. In March 1784, with a typical mixture of excitement and caution, as well as an ironic nod towards the failure of Ilmenau to yield the hoped-for silver, he wrote his famous letter to Herder announcing his success. Like his work on geology, this first culmination of his anatomical research reflects the way that he had come to conceive of science since reading Buffon in 1780. The particular insight gets its significance from its connection to the whole, its Verbindung mit dem Ganzen, where das Ganze implies the unity and self-consistency of nature. And this grand vision of nature as a unity has heretical implications. Sorry, I'm getting a bit, I'm sorry, I've had a cold and I've just got a little bit of lingering coughing and spluttering. So yes, and this grand vision of nature as a unity has heretical implications. The heresy is made clear in a letter to Kniebe of November 1784. Hier schicke ich dir endlich die Abhandlung aus dem Knochenreiche. Ich habe mich enthalten, das Resultat, worauf schon Herder in seinen Ideen deutet, schon jetzt so merken zu lassen, dass man nämlich den Unterschied des Menschen vom Tier in nichts Einzelnem finden könne. Vielmehr ist der Mensch auf Nächste mit den Tieren verwandt. Die Übereinstimmung des Ganzen macht ein jedes Geschöpf zu dem, was es ist. Und der Mensch ist Mensch so gut durch die Gestalt und Natur seiner oberen Kinnlade als durch die Gestalt und Natur des letzten Gliedes seiner kleinen Zehe Mensch. Und so ist wieder jede Kreatur nur ein Ton, eine Schattierung einer großen Harmonie, die man auch im Ganzen und Großen studieren muss. Sonst ist jedes Einzelne ein toter Buchstabe. Wie es vor alten Zeiten, da die Menschen an der Erde lagen, eine Wohltat war, ihnen auf den Himmel zu deuten und sie aufs Geistige aufmerksam zu machen, so ist jetzt eine größere, sie nach der Erde zurückzuführen und die Elastizität ihrer angefesselten Ballons ein wenig zu vermindern. The essay, with its heretical dynamite safely hidden out of sight, was finished in December. Goethe's ambition in the 1780s was to construct a unified picture of nature independent of divine action and wholly self-consistent in its laws and processes. So, having studied geology and mammal anatomy, he had to take up botany too. His botanical studies began in spring 1785. In March, he went with Kniebel to study with the botanists in Jena. In April, he set up a seed tray so that he could study the development of plants from their beginnings. The eventual result of his botanical labours had to wait until his return from Italy in 1788. The essay Über die Metamorphose der Pflanzen, published in 1790, is an argument about finding form in formlessness. As Astrid Tantillo has shown, Goethe was not just interested in nature's forms, he was also interested in its formlessness. Among his writings on botany are numerous discussions of apparently formless or form-breaking species of plant, such as carnations and dog roses. Formlessness is interesting because it poses a challenge to our understanding of form. But the challenge of formlessness and its importance for Goethe is spelt out in a piece from 1823 titled Problem und Erwiderung, which arose out of a debate with biologist Ernst Mayr. Problem und Erwiderung. The Problem is by Goethe, the Erwiderung by Mayr. The piece is especially interesting because it states, in its most general form, the question that has animated much of Goethe's scientific work since 1780. Now, the specific question posed in Goethe's Problem is how to define the concept of a species. How much variety can exist within a single species before the concept species becomes meaningless? Certain species, such as the dog rose, seem to exhibit so much variety as to be barely classifiable as a single species. The dog rose was, in Goethe's formulation, a liederlich or promiscuous species. Dog roses show an extreme abundance in the way they repeat and vary a flowering plant's basic structural elements. They are charakterlose Geschlechter, denen man vielleicht kaum Spezies zuschreiben darf, dass sie sich in grenzenlose Varietäten verlieren and jeder Bestimmung, jedem Gesetz entschlüpfen. Indeed, the very idea of metamorphosis, that is, nature's tendency to repeat with variations a fundamental structural unit, seemed to break down the idea of a species. This was the particular problem that Goethe was wrestling with. On the one hand, the idea of a species requires the continuity of form through time, or in Goethe's language, a Spezifikationstrieb. He also thought of this as a centripetal tendency. This was what prevented individual members of a species from diverging so far from one another as to destroy the identity of the species. On the other hand, the species possessed the centrifugal tendency of metamorphosis. This tendency führt ins Formlose, zerstört das Wissen, löst es auf. The problem has been central to recent debates in the philosophy of biology. Evolutionary theory tells us that a given species concept, dog rose, only represents a single snapshot of plant evolution in the course of evolutionary time. Now, if at this moment in time we were to plot all the members of the species as points in a two-dimensional space, according to their genetic diversity, we would see a fuzzy cluster of points within a more or less clearly bounded space. That's one of the ways evolutionary biologists define species today. However, over the course of evolutionary time, the cluster would move around in the space due to genetic drift and the evolutionary pressures of a changing environment. And so our concept of a species has to accommodate a degree of movement. It'll need to be looser and more flexible than we might have wanted. Looser and more flexible in the 3 dimensions that make up evolutionary space-time. Over evolutionary time, nature is not fixed and cannot be forced into a static system. And this is why Goethe begins his Problem with the phrase, natürlich System, ein widersprechender Ausdruck. The contradictoriness of the idea of a natural system tells us that the problem is actually even greater than we might first have supposed. And it's not confined to biological species. Goethe asks Meyer to imagine that the history of the universe and of all natural phenomena has its origin in an unknowable single act of genesis, an original singularity in space-time, if you like. The diversity of phenomena we see today has arisen by a kind of centrifugal dispersion away from this punctual origin, or, as Goethe puts it, by means of metamorphosis. If this is so, then how is it that the phenomena of nature have dispersed from their punctual origin in such a way as to have complex and durable forms, which even have regular formal interrelationships among themselves? How is it that nature has structure and is not mere chaotic entropy? Die Natur hat kein System. Sie ist Leben und Folge aus einem unbekannten Zentrum zu einer nicht erkennbaren Grenze. Die Idee der Metamorphose ist eine höchst ehrwürdige, aber zugleich höchst gefährliche Gabe von oben. Sie führt ins Formlose, zerstört das Wissen, löst es auf. Sie ist gleich der Vis Centrifuga und würde sich ins Unendliche verlieren, wäre ihr nicht ein Gegengewicht zugegeben. Ich meine den Spezifikationstrieb, das sehr Beharrlichkeitsvermögen dessen, was einmal zur Wirklichkeit gekommen. Eine Vis Centripeta, welcher in ihrem tiefsten Grunde keine Äußerlichkeit etwas anhaben kann. And with that idea of the vis centripeta, we've got back to the idea of form, the persistence of form through time. The language of the passage is striking in the light of modern evolutionary theory. Goethe's description of his theory of metamorphosis as a dangerous gift that dissolves knowledge looks like a predecessor of Daniel Dennett's account of Darwinian evolution in his study Darwin's Dangerous Idea. For Dennett, evolution functions as a universal solvent that dissolves all of the fundamental concepts of biology and even philosophy. This is why Darwinian evolution is so powerful, and for believers in a world that has divine or human purposes, so dangerous. I'd like to conclude just by clarifying what I've said and what I haven't said. So a lot of things I haven't said. Obviously, I don't want to deny the importance of the Ilmenau project. Ilmenau was decisive. It focused Goethe's very considerable practical and problem-solving intelligence on science. It made him engage for the first time in his life with a body of scientific literature. But what it didn't give him, and what he did find in Buffon in 1780, was a vision. He was excited by Buffon's Epoch for three main reasons. First, the Epoch presented a systematic picture of nature as a whole. Second, Buffon insisted that nature obeys its own laws, that natural substances have their own telos, not ours. And third, the Epoch offered a realistic alternative to Christian orthodoxy. Now, I'm not saying that when Goethe found these ideas in Buffon in 1780, they were completely new to him. I've mentioned that Goethe knew the anti-teleological argument in the appendix to Book 1 of Spinoza's Ethics. But reading Buffon did show him for the first time a vision of nature that both satisfied the Spinozan principle of nature's self-consistency and persuasively and vividly represented der Gottheit lebendiges Kleid, in the words of the Erdgeist. It satisfied him philosophically and aesthetically. And it was reading Buffon that triggered his studies in geology, anatomy, and botany in the early 1780s, and the question that animated them. How is it that nature has form and is not mere formless entropy? Rock formations have an intrinsic tendency to solidify in regular forms. All flowering plants develop by repeating and varying a single formal element. Mammal skeletons are transformations of a single type of skeleton. The questions we should ask of nature are questions about form. Now, I don't want to suggest that the concern with form is all there is of interest and value in Goethe's scientific thinking. I haven't touched on some of his signature ideas. The notion of dynamic polarity that was inspired by Kant's metaphysische Anfangsgründe der Naturwissenschaft, and which Goethe first used in his essay on plant metamorphosis in 1790, or the idea of the economy of nature that was so important for his studies of mammal anatomy in the early 1790s, or the concept of Steigerung that he first used in 1798 during his collaboration with Schelling. I've only alluded briefly to the important question of Goethe's role in the history of ideas of species evolution. And the most conspicuous absence from my argument obviously has been his work on optics and colour, which I freely admit doesn't fit well into the picture of his science that I've been trying to draw. And no doubt there are other omissions and also questions, which I look forward to. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for taking us on this tour of Goethe's ascent from exploiter, collector, observer to systematic thinker of the natural world. Quite a few things, I think, that call for further discussion or for further questions. So I just want to remind people in the online audience, please raise your digital hand if you want to ask a question. And once it's your turn, please unmute your mic and then mute it again. Otherwise, we have strange sounds in the room here. If you don't do this, mute it back after you asked your question. Okay, I then open the floor both to the room and to the online room. First questions, please.
Well, one always starts by saying something nice about nature, but that really was an extraordinarily fine nature. Very precise, very well documented, very coherently chronological, and calling out some of Goethe's finest writing, incidentally. I mean, some of the stuff that he says about science is as good as anything he ever wrote anywhere in the body of his work. So it really whets one's appetite for more. and you're going to deal with all those other questions that you said you left out in the finished study. But it's obviously made immense progress.
Thank you.
Okay, that was a comment rather than a question. Yeah, okay. Please speak into
Sorry,
the microphone.
a very interesting talk, which I knew very little about, I must say. But a question for you, Matthew, and then a question about Goethe and his view. Did you think there's a great distinction between natural history and science, particularly if you're looking at botany or even mineralogy? You don't have to answer it, but I mean, Buffon, I would have thought was a natural historian rather than, but not that I've read all 5 volumes. Anyway, but the question is, you mentioned such a lot about form and how Goethe was interested in form, but very often what follows form is the function. Did he think of function as an end if he was sort of teleologically interested?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll answer the first question very quickly. I mean, as for my views on the relation between the term natural history and science, in a sense, it doesn't really matter that much what I think. But the term natural historian is just particularly useful to capture what people in the 18th and 19th centuries were doing. People who were researching and writing on the natural world. The natural historian is just a useful and apt term. Of course, a lot of this work is descriptive, but then there is always an element of that in scientific work. If I were to go off to Borneo and explore an area of jungle that had not been explored before and find a new species of insect, then the first thing I would be doing would be natural history, in effect. It would be natural. I'd provide a full description of it, and that would go into one of the big journals, one would hope, and I'd be very, very pleased with that. And that would be science. It's a contribution to science. So anyway, but that's that. As for the other question, sorry, what it was about?
Well,
form and function. Yes. Okay. So this is this becomes an issue most of all in Goethe's writings about mammal anatomy. Now, our understanding, and there are reasons for that to do with the history of the sciences. It's partly because in botany, for instance, in the 18th century, very little was really known about the function of different plant elements of plants. I mean, we know what stamens and pistils do and so on, but really to understand plant function, you need a lot of chemistry, which simply wasn't available in the 18th century. It's much easier to say interesting things about function in terms of animals, because the functions of animals are so easily visible. There's a fascinating passage in one of these mid-1790s unpublished essays. It's a great shame that much of the stuff that Goethe wrote in the 1790s about mammal anatomy, he just didn't publish at the time for various reasons, and only published then sort of circa 1820 in the Morphologische Hefte. But there's an absolutely fascinating passage where he talks about, he comes to the idea of convergent evolution. If you think about fish, and if you think about, say, seals, They have similar body forms, similar, you could say aerodynamic, although that's kind of the wrong word, shapes, and they have flippers and tails. That's to say, they've evolved in water. So, and Goethe says that, and he actually says it. They've evolved in water. This is what, and they bear no relation. Of course, there's no family relationship between seals and fish at all. And convergent evolution, therefore, is one of the great proofs of evolution. And Darwin picks this up and says, of course, the same thing. And that's one point where function becomes really important. It also becomes important in Goethe's studies of mammal skulls, because the whole point about mammal skulls is that the design of mammal skulls comes down to functions, in particular functions of eating. Your diet determines what kind of teeth you have. What kind of teeth you have determines what jaw shape you have. And the jaw shape determines the overall shape of the skull. So yes, the form question is very, very closely related to the function question. If Goethe had published this work in the 1790s, if Alexander von Humboldt had hung around longer and not gone off to South America, who knows what would have happened.
We have a question from Angus in the online audience. Angus, if you unmute your telephone, your microphone, please. Thank you.
Hello, Angus.
Hi, Matthew. Can you hear me?
Very well, thank you. Very well.
Right. Yeah, thank you for a very, very clear lecture. I agree with Jim. The exposition was extremely clear and extremely interesting to me as well, what you were saying. I was especially interested when you started to relate Goethe's ideas to Daniel Dennett and kind of brought Goethe's philosophies of science, I suppose, into a 20th century discourse. And I was wondering whether in what terms you would talk about Goethe in relation to a more contemporary philosophy of science. Partly because I feel as though, and you mentioned this in your talk, so during the period that you're writing about or speaking about today, Goethe is interested in form, and he's interested especially when he's comparing plant species or also animal species, that we need a kind of general criterion for comparison. Sometimes he calls this a typus or an urtypus and says that we need these kind of general comparative categories in order to make a comparison between different types of form. And you also mentioned that in a way he's using this approach to a categorization like that of a species. And during this period, there are various explanations going around, I suppose, in German idealism as to why our ideas about nature seem to match up with nature. But according to my recollection of it, and part of this is in Goethe's correspondence with Schiller around the period of the Urpflanzer in the 1790s, he seems to me to reject Schelling's idea that the reason why our ideas about nature match up with nature itself is because we are nature thinking about itself, right? So the Schellingian explanation is that if nature is thinking about itself through human subjectivity, then that's the reason why our ideas match up with nature. It seems to me that Goethe rejects that idea. So his morphology becomes a much more tentative philosophy of science, one which is probably not that consistent in its arguments, and which might, in more contemporary philosophy, be seen as in some ways closer to pragmatism. The idea that certain ideas may be useful or valid during certain periods, but then they cease to be so because nature is always changing. So would you see Goethe's ideas about science in those terms? Or is he more of a theorist, a strong theorist than I think he is?
Thanks, Angus. That's an awful lot of this, I think, depends on who he's talking to, and Goethe is. I mean, he loves getting into dialogue with people, and so quite often he will draw close to the views of an interlocutor or correspondent for the purposes of the dialogue. So a lot of it does depend on who he's talking to. I think that as far as Schelling's concerned, my recollection, and I did read all of this stuff from the late 1780s quite recently, so I think it's relatively fresh. My recollection is that his objection to Schelling is essentially the same as his objection to all post-Kantian idealism, which is that there is a confusion in post-Kantian idealism between objects and subjects. That post-Kantian idealism tends to take, tends to read categorizations that are present in objects as if they were subjective. And so your description of Schelling's contribution, Schelling thinks about, nature thinking itself through human beings, kind of captures that exactly. I mean, that's precisely what Goethe didn't like. Another way of putting it, I suppose, is to think, if you were to take a kind of Kantian line on this and say, well, there's in order to understand nature, we have to divide stuff into classes and categories of things. Sorry, I'm not using category in a Kantian sense. So, we need to divide stuff into classes. We need to divide stuff into, giraffes and leopards. Now, the question is then, given all of these debates about the relation between subject and object that are going on in Kant and subsequently, where does that division of the world into giraffes and leopards happen? Where in the relation between subjects and objects does it occur? Now, what Kant says unambiguously is that division into classes, that happens in the subject. Mm-hmm. And Goethe absolutely cannot understand that. It makes absolutely no sense to him. And that's a sense in which he calls himself, repeatedly, he calls himself a realist. And that is how I generally understand him. Now, your point about pragmatism, if we read his writings about optics and colour, a slightly different pattern emerges. And I think in that field, he does draw closer to the sort of pragmatism that you're talking about. I think for quite different reasons, though. I think because fundamentally, one of the problems with his work on optics and colour is he can't decide what it is. He can't decide what his work is doing. He can't decide whether he's actually making statements about optics or whether he's making statements about human perception of colour. And yes, of course, he knows that in a way he has to do both because, some of what he's saying is about the physiology of the eye. Well, of course, the physiology of the eye is, again, it's an object, it's not in the subject, as Goethe well knew. But there is a sort of vagueness there or a hovering between two different positions, which I think causes him all sorts of problems.
Mhm.
So that would be my answer.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions in the audience, both online and in the? Yeah, yeah.
Of course.
Well, the whole subject could bring up a whole list of questions. You were perfectly right to say that at the beginning, I think. But one is, he was interested in geology. Geology is linked up to botany too, and to zoology. In fossils, for example, did he know anything about fossils? Did he have any idea of what fossils were meant to represent in nature, in the unity of nature? That's one little question.
Can I answer that quickly first
yes.
before the second? I mean, I'm keen to hear the second question, but I can just because I'm not very good at holding two questions in my head at the same time. There's a big discussion about fossils going on at the time. I mean, it's huge. You know, why do we find seashells on the tops of mountains? This is mad. And so, you know, one of the hypotheses is, and this appeared in one of the passages I quoted, that and it's in Herder's Idee, and it's the idea that, you know, that in the early history of the Earth, it was covered in water, sea everywhere, yeah, deposits, and the land has changed and the seas receded. So that the debate about fossils is very, very big. Yes, and he wrote some interesting little natural historical essays on fossils. He was fascinated by this. So yeah.
But another one, far more difficult, I suppose, is, you know, when we think of nature, we also think of objects in the sky, do we not? I mean, the sun, you know, and I mean, had Goethe read Galileo, for example, and the stuff on the satellites of Jupiter, I mean, that would, I mean, that's, do you see, nowadays we think of nature, or at least most people, I would suggest, should think of nature as astronomy and cosmology, most certainly. And then you bring in physics and mathematics. So there could be a whole lot of entanglement there, to use a scientific term.
It's one of those things where you get a strong sense of which areas of science play to Goethe's strengths. Yeah, and natural history of the kind that I've been describing, you know, rocks, plants, animals, all of that really played to his strengths. Astronomy didn't, and he recognized that. You know, he was interested, sure, but you know, by long before Goethe's time, astronomy was so thoroughly mathematized as a science that without a really good grounding in mathematics, you just couldn't get anywhere. And that was not Goethe's strength. So he actually, yes, I mean, he kind of stays away from astronomy. I mean, he says at a couple of points, he makes various comments about the role of mathematics in science. He gets into arguments about mathematics because of Newton, and because of the way that Newton's experiments with colour, the results they produce, results that are mathematizable, and Goethe really had a big problem with that. And so he starts thinking about, well, what's the role of mathematics in science? And he feels very ambivalent about it. But one thing he's clear about is astronomy. Yes, completely mathematized, and that's as it should be. And that's not for me.
But quite a bit of it is visible. Comets, for example.
Yeah.
You could not say about comets. Something had been said before.
I'm not aware of anything about comets.
Well, there are objects in the sky.
Yeah.
So birds.
Well, which is another thing that he says very little about. He knows practically nothing about ornithology, which is it's one of the things that he gets out of the friendship with Eckermann, because Eckermann is a good ornithologist who really knows what he's talking about, and he takes Goethe out on walks in the countryside and teaches Goethe ornithology, about which he knew practically nothing before then.
I think my question is more a question of understanding. I was slightly struck by equating formlessness with characterlessness. Did I get this right? And if so, could you kind of go into the premise on which this is done a little bit?
Yeah,
please?
Astrid, yeah. So the comment that he makes is, and this is in this debate with Meyer about what we mean by a species, what we mean by a biological species, and some species are, if you like, more species-like than others, in the sense that, and this the sort of way I was trying to describe how contemporary evolutionary biologists tend to think about species. If you thought about all of the individuals in a species and did genetic analysis of all of them and then mapped them in two-dimensional space, you would get a strong cluster of points and then a sort of fuzziness. Now, some species are more like that than others. Some are extremely concentrated, others are not. And the point about the dog rose and his interest in it is it appears not to be. So it appears to be a characterless species.
Yeah, I think this is exactly what I don't buy. Yeah, but that's a different matter.
So it's a species that has so much diversity within it among its individuals that it seems to almost not to be a species. Now, there are all sorts of ways in which that can be true. One might not like it, but there are all sorts of ways it can be true. For instance, I mean, if you look at birds, some bird species hybridize a lot. Gulls hybridize all the time, ducks do it. Some species barely hybridize at all. And that would be an indicator, for instance, of this sort of characterlessness of a species. And I think that's the sort of thing he means. I mean, he doesn't talk about hybridization, but I think that's what he's guessing at. Is that?
Yeah, it makes more sense than. Yeah. I've managed to pick up in the talk. Thank you. Questions? Any? No. In which case, let me thank you very much again for a really, really, really profound and wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.